The single most mysterious place in all of A Song of Ice and Fire may well be Stygai, the corpse city that lies in the heart of the Shadowlands at the headwaters of the Black River Ash, whose polluted waters flow down to and through ancient Asshai by the Shadow. Asshai is itself a huge mystery, being built all of greasy black stone, which drinks the sunlight from the very air. But we don't even know what Stygai is made of, or what is there to be made of stuff. Its name comes from Conan's Stygia, and before that from Greek underworld mythology. It smells like Mordor. It glows like a color out of space. So what happened to the Shadowlands? What is Stygai? Why is it a corpse city? Why is the river polluted, the stone greasy, the land shadowed, and the fish blind, white, deformed, and poisonous to eat? What's the deal with the Shadowbinders, with the cult of starry wisdom, and with the Bloodstone Emperor? Who built Asshai? And why do Sept and Barth and also Daenerys think that dragons first came from Asshai before Valyria ever existed? Well, if you're looking for one video to answer all those questions, here we are. And thanks very much for clicking on the video. I do hope it lives up to your expectations. And if it does, do click the thumbs up and leave a comment below the video. Make sure you're subscribed, because today we're going to try to figure out what exactly lies in Stygai, in the Shadow's heart. And also, what is this capital S shadow by which Asshai by the Shadow is by? To do this, we'll be conducting a disaster hunter style forensic investigation of the Shadowlands. So we're not really doing symbolism or Azor high prophecy today. We're going to be focusing on what happened here. And to help solve the mystery, we'll also be dipping into some of the very darkest literature that George was inspired by when he created Asshai by the Shadow, the Shadowlands, and Stygai, the corpse city at the Shadow's heart. Alright, let's get started with the city of Asshai. And this video is pretty much going to be like a journey up the River Ash from Asshai to Stygai. And although we unfortunately don't have the time to do the dramatic reading of all of these paragraphs, we will go in order and play detective to try to figure out what's going on here. So the Maesters start off by setting the vibe and saying some mysterious things like, "Now we have come to the end of our knowledge, and even the Asshai do not claim to know who built their city, but that the ancient Asshai do believe that the lifespan of their city is the beginning of time until the end of time." So that's probably not accurate. But the more helpful information comes next, where we learn that the entire city of Asshai, famously, every single building and even the streets are made of the same substance, which is the mysterious oily or greasy black stone. The oily stone and greasy stone terms are used interchangeably, so that's the same thing. The Maesters mention how this greasy black stone seems to drink the light from the very air, which kind of sounds like a magical effect. And then they go on to describe the more wide-ranging effects of the capital S shadow in general, which renders the nights very black and even the days gray and gloomy. Next, we get the info on the tremendous size versus population disparity of Asshai, i.e. it's the largest city in the world, bigger than Volantis, Karth, King's Landing, and Old Town combined, and it has enormous land walls and yet only the population of a market-sized town, with approximately 1 in 10 buildings at most in use. Everyone there is quiet and furtive and suspicious, often hiding their faces with masks or veils or by riding in closed litters. And of course, we know Quay the Shadowbinder wears a mask like all Shadowbinders, and Melisandre is almost certainly wearing a glamour. And speaking of magicians, most famously, Asshai is the home of every kind of wizard, and here we will do the dramatic reading. Warlocks, wizards, alchemists, moon singers, red priests, black alchemists, necromancers, aeromancers, pyromancers, blood mages, torturers, inquisitors, poisoners, gods' wives, night walkers, shape changers, worshippers of the black goat and the pale child and the lion of night, all find welcome in Asshai by the Shadow, where nothing is forbidden. Here they are free to practice their spells without restraint or censure, conduct their obscene rites, and fornicate with demons if that is their desire. Alright, so that paragraph is pretty self-explanatory, unless you want to know exactly just how you fornicate with the demon. And also, if you think that I know that, I can explain it to you. I'm pretty sure the diagram is still just that. And then the very next paragraph mentions the infamous Shadowbinders, but we'll come back to them later, and also in a video that I put out last week. Next, we hear more about the very toxic conditions of Asshai and the Shadowlands, and we're told that there are no children in Asshai, and elsewhere we learn that there are no animals here either, and that any animals that are brought here soon die. I don't know what happens to children if you bring them to Asshai, but probably nothing good. It's like bringing your kid to the bar, you know, back when the bars were like smoking, only much worse. worse than that even. I'm pretty sure that's grounds for losing a custody hearing. I hang out in Asshai with my kid. So all kidding aside, the oily blackstone is toxic. It's too gnarly for children or animals or regular plants, probably for old people. You get the idea. It's poisonous. So despite all that extreme gnarliness, Asshai is nevertheless a thriving trading port. And it does have a tremendous location athwart the Saffron Straits. Saffron itself is actually said to be more valuable than gold by weight in this world, so there may be a valuable spice trade flowing through this strait. And overall, this is very similar to Karth, sitting astride the Jade Straits and growing rich off the trade that goes through there. So Asshai actually survives off this trade, and I don't mean monetarily. The traders that sail to Asshai bring food and wine and water, which is stuff you can't easily get in Asshai because absolutely nothing edible grows anywhere in the Shadowlands. The only two plants that we know grow in the Shadowlands for sure are ghost grass and the plant that makes the strangler, which is a poison. So the ghost grass is like the worst weed ever. It wipes out every other plant. And the Dothraki even have an ancient prophecy. I know we said we were going to do prophecy, but just this one, the Dothraki say that ghost grass at the end of time will cover the world and snuff out all life. And again, the strangler is made from a leafy plant that grows here, but the strangler is a poison. That's the one that Olenna Tyrell and Peter Baelish used to kill Joffrey at the Purple Wedding, and also the poison Maester Crescent tried to use on Melisandre and ended up using on himself. So the sailors coming to Asshai and bringing all this lovely, lovely edible food and stuff, they are coming mostly for gold and gems, although the gold of the Shadowlands, it's tainted. Wouldn't you know it? Damn it. Should have read the warning label. Some gems may contain demons. And in all seriousness, it just says that the gold is unhealthy in some way, but it basically just means cursed. And what that tells us is that even though the oily black stone itself is definitely magically weird, the entire peninsula of the Shadowlands seems to be poisoned and shadowed and toxic, not just Asshai. And that means it's time to talk about the Black River Ash. So in the sidebar about how animals don't last long in Asshai, the Black River Ash is mentioned as a potential source of the general toxicity of the Shadowlands. The Maesters mention that animals are more sensitive to such foul waters as the River Ash, even if they do not drink them. So it makes it sound like they're describing a lingering effect that isn't purely confined to the river, but which may emanate from the river. Shout out to Maester Harmon's On Miasmas. I'm sure that's a great read, and also to Septon Barth, whose Higher Mysteries explanation for all of this apparently didn't pass the Maesterly peer review and wasn't included in the World of Ice and Fire somehow. Sorry, but it's a good thing, because otherwise this video would be entirely redundant. So you still need the explanation, good for me, and here is the longer description of the Black River Ash. The waters of the ash glisten black beneath the noonday sun, and glimmer with a pale green phosphorescence by night. And such fish as swim in the river are blind and twisted, so deformed and hideous to look upon that only fools and shadowbinders will eat of their flesh. So it almost sounds like a river of Shade of the Evening Warlock wine, but of course the Warlock wine doesn't glow green at night, so theory rejected. And good news, we did find some animals, give the blind white fish some love and quit calling them hideous and deformed. They're ugly cute. But for real though, you probably don't want to eat them. I mean, the river is clearly poisonous. The water is black, just like the oily stone, and it glows like it's radioactive. Of course, this would be a magical version of radioactive. But yeah, Asshai does obviously feel like the magical fantasy version of a Fallout zone, much like the Doom of Valyria, and thus the river could be the fantasy equivalent of radioactive, meaning that the river itself could be the source of the magical poison and the shadow, or that it could be the conduit for such, carrying the poison magic down from some source upriver in the mountains, someplace like Stygian. Usually rivers spread nutrient-rich sediments along their banks, so there could be some sort of inverted, poisonous version of that process happening here. That would explain the tainted gold and gems and the lack of edible, non-poisonous plants. Alright, so there's more about the River Ash, but it comes in the info about the Shadowbinders and the Shadow itself. And apparently the Shadowbinders are the only people who even dare to set foot outside the enormous land walls of Asshai. They alone follow the ash upriver into the Heart of Darkness. And shout out to Joseph Conrad's famous and gruesome novel, Heart of Darkness, and whatever is the opposite of a shout out to King Leopold II of Belgium, whose unspeakable horrors in the Congo are the backdrop for Heart of Darkness. And I do recommend watching the rest of History's series on King Leopold and the Heart of Darkness novel, because even though it is horrific, it is very important history. And the takeaway here is that George is is referencing the Heart of Darkness to reinforce the idea that unspeakable horrors have been practiced here in Asshai, beginning with slavery and getting worse from there. And we'll talk about the Bloodstone Emperor in just a second. So essentially, George wants us to know that it's not just creepy, fantasy, fun and games shenanigans, just fun fantasy world building. The dark magic here is tied to unspeakable misery and horror. So returning to the text, we read about the narrow valley through the mountains of the Morn that the ash runs through, howling. Demons and dragons and worse apparently make their lairs here, and that kind of sounds like spooky traveler talk. But there are, of course, many clues that dragons do come from Asshai, such as Bran's coma dream in A Game of Thrones, which shows him Asshai by the shadow, where dragons stirred beneath the sunrise. Daenerys was actually taught that dragons come from Asshai, and this is again from A Game of Thrones. She had heard that the first dragons had come from the east, from the Shadowlands beyond Asshai and the islands of the Jade Sea. Perhaps some were still living there, in realms strange and wild. And then finally, Illyrio is lying about Dany's dragon's eggs having come from Asshai, because they are almost certainly the ones that Alyssa Farman stole from Dragonstone. But Illyrio's lie is supposed to be believable, which means there are apparently enough associations between dragons and Asshai that are commonly known by people that it is a believable lie. So there's more evidence, but that's just the stuff from the first book. I always like to start there. And so it is possible, or even likely, that dragons did at least once live in the Shadowlands. So maybe it's just a bunch of demon and dragon poo turning the river black and toxic. No, it's probably not that, but it does tell us that the further one goes upriver, if one is a shadowbinder, the more twisted the creatures are. So hard to say, maybe there are deformed creatures and demons and things, but the point is they are describing a toxic environment that grows stronger the closer you get to Stygai, the corpse city at the shadow's heart. And it does say that even the shadowbinders are afraid to go there, but I kind of doubt that. I don't know why you would go beyond the city if not to go to Stygai. But again, the implication is that Stygai is the most toxic part of the Shadowlands, and even the epicenter of the shadow, the heart of shadow. Now, given that we have a heart of winter, which seems to be the source of the other's power, Bran saw that in his coma dream. Could it be that this capital S shadow's heart is something similar, perhaps an equivalent hinge of the world? And did it once used to be the heart of summer, perhaps? It is kind of on the equator. So perhaps before the shadow fell, this was the heart of summer, and now it is the heart of shadow. And the idea that Stygai is called the corpse city implies that it died somehow. So pretty much all of this language implies that some sort of huge transformation has taken place here, something which affected the entire Shadowlands. And Stygai is, again, implied as the source of this dark, toxic shadow magic. And thus, it is the place to look to explain the transformation of the Shadowlands. All right, we're ready to read about Stygai. Finally, right? Oh, wait, we just did. That's all there is. That's all there is. I guess we'll never know what's at the heart of the shadow. Man, that's too bad. I promised I would tell you guys. I'm kidding. Of course, I'm going to give you my Stygai theory. And to do that, let's take a look at the major disaster myth that is associated with Asshai, which is naturally the Long Night. So this is going to be the Bloodstone Emperor version of the legend of the Long Night. And as you can see on the screen, we have the murder of a magical woman, the Amethyst Empress, who was actually the rightful ruler of the fabled Great Empire of the Dawn. So this is some sort of king's blood, blood magic, kin-slaying ritual act, some kind of powerful and abominable magical ritual conducted by the Bloodstone Emperor, and it was preceded by dark arts, torture, necromancy, slavery, heresy, etc., etc. So this blood betrayal, usurpation, and murder of the Amethyst Empress was so heinous that the records of the further east say that this was in fact the cause of the Long Night, which consists of the Maiden Maid of Light, meaning the sun, turning her back on the world. And the Maiden Maid of Light is pretty clearly based on the Japanese sun goddess Amaterasu, and the blood betrayal even has parallels to Amaterasu's dishonoring by her brother Susanoo. Most importantly, it's Azor Ahai who comes in as the hero at the end of the Bloodstone Emperor story to solve the problem of the Long Night and defeat the forces of darkness. We are told multiple times that the story of Azor Ahai, as well as the prophecy of his return, both come from Asshai, and thus we conclude that the Long Night was felt in this general area very strongly, and that there are specific links between the Long Night and Asshai. And in fact, the Long Night seems to have transformed everything in this area, both culturally and physically. The Great Empire of the Dawn falls and is not reborn, and instead many different nations spring up in their wake as the tribes of men go their separate ways. ways, each suspicious of the other. The world is described as a broken place, and of course nowhere is more broken than the Shadowlands. And just to make sure I'm saying the obvious thing, we're looking for a disaster that caused a magical shadow, and the Long Night is specifically a magical disaster that consists of darkness and shadow, so it's a pretty good fit. Now there is very clearly a smoking gun right smack in the middle of the Bloodstone Emperor legend, and that would be where it says that he cast down the true gods to worship a black stone that had fallen from the sky. And as I always like to point out, the Bloodstone Emperor is effectively named after this bleeding star stone, meaning if comets and meteors are bleeding stars, then the meteorite would be a bleeding star stone, a bloodstone. And of course there is a long tradition in fantasy and in Marvel Comics of taking bloodstone, which is of course a real gemstone, it's my birthstone, and turning it into something more magical, just because of the name Bloodstone and the legend of the creation of Bloodstone, which is that Jesus' blood dripped on some green chalcedony when he was on the cross, and thus Bloodstone is consecrated by Christ's blood and has magical properties. So yeah, Bloodstone Emperor, he's named after the black stone that he worshipped. And the word worship implies that the black stone may have some magical power, or even some evil Lovecraftian intelligence. And when we think of the heart of shadow, well, it makes me think of the heart of a fallen star, which is another phrase used to describe a meteorite. So maybe what we'll find in Stygian is the heart of a fallen dark star. And obviously the oily black stone might be connected to this black stone that the Bloodstone Emperor worshipped during the Long Night. It's probably not possible that all of the oily black stone is meteorite, because that's just way too much meteorite material to build the entire city of Asshai. But it does seem like there may be a connection in general between the greasy black stone and the black stone that the Bloodstone Emperor worshipped, the one that fell from the sky. And I will have an explanation for that coming later in the video. Meteor and comet impacts can cause impact winter events, which is basically like a long night, and that's even without magic. So if you sprinkle a little magic sauce on an impact winter, you basically have the Long Night. The Shadowlands are, again, comparable to Valyria as a kind of magical fallout zone. And the Doom of Valyria was basically George sprinkling a little bit of magic onto a natural disaster, a volcanic chain eruption. And so the Long Night could be similar, magic sprinkled on top of a natural disaster. And again, the smoking gun is right there. It's the black stone that fell at the time of the Long Night that the Bloodstone Emperor worshipped. And so, could the Bloodstone Emperor's meteor be the thing that is in Stygian causing all the shadow? Well, we don't know where the rulers of the Great Empire of the Dawn ruled from, only that J.R.R came from Asshai and that he ended the Long Night that the Bloodstone Emperor caused. So, could the Bloodstone Emperor have been worshipping his black meteor in Stygian? The answer is yes. Yes, I did change the color of my light from the last recording session, which was definitely not on a different day. All right, now the answer is yes, the Bloodstone Emperor may have been operating out of Asshai or Stygian, because the Great Empire of the Dawn, which the Bloodstone Emperor usurped, is very clearly the most obvious choice if we are looking for the civilization that built Asshai. That would offer a tidy explanation for why J.R.R comes out of Asshai and defeats the forces of darkness of the Bloodstone Emperor to end the Long Night. They were from the same empire. Perhaps they were from the same royal line. Perhaps J.R.R is the vengeful son of the Amethyst Empress. There are some various character parallels which we can explore a different time to sort of, form a theory about that kind of stuff. But the point is that if we were to begin looking for the civilization that built Asshai, the first thing that we should be looking for is some sort of ancient Dragon Lord civilization with direct ties to J.R.R. Those are by far the two most important story elements which are tied to Asshai, J.R.R and dragons. And both of those things are central to Daenerys' plot, and Dany, of course, is the one who tells us that dragons might come from Asshai in Book 1. Bran's Coma Dream vision of dragons from Asshai comes in Book 1 also, as I mentioned. And then it's in Books 2 and 3 that we get all the J.R.R mythology, which comes from Asshai and which is all about waking dragons. So we're 3 books into the series, and really there's just a lot of clues that dragons might have come from Asshai originally. And then in the World of Ice and Fire, of course, Septon Barth drops the bomb and seemingly refers to the same dragons come from Asshai story that Dany heard growing up. In Asshai, the tales are many and confused, but certain texts, all impossibly ancient, claim that dragons first came from the shadow, a place where all of our learning fails us. These Asshai histories say that a people so ancient they had no name first tamed dragons in the shadow and brought them to Valyria, teaching the Valyrians their arts before departing from the annals. So that's pretty cool, and take notice of the focus on the shadow. That's where the dragons and demons live, and that's where some mysterious people first tamed dragons, in the shadow. So not only should the builders of Asshai be tied to dragons and Azor Ahai, but also the Shadow. This fits well with the idea that Jon and Dany, the two Azor Ahai reborn people, are both descended from the Valyrian Dragon Lords, and are both being advised by Shadowbinders, as we discussed in last week's Shadowbinder video. Thanks for watching. And then obviously the main thrust of the passage is just Septon Barth giving us the backstory for Dany telling us that she heard dragons may have come from Asshai. That comes from the ancient Asshai histories. And one would imagine if Dany was taught that, she would have been taught by Viserys, which means this legend of dragons coming from Asshai is probably something the Valyrians and then the Targaryens knew about, because how else would Viserys know about it to teach Dany? So you can see why I say that any potential candidate for the civilization that built Asshai really does have to be a Dragon Lord civilization. And given that Azor Ahai is supposed to be reborn to wake dragons, the original Azor Ahai was probably a Dragon Lord too, almost certainly from this Asshai Proto-Valyrian civilization. So another big clue that there were Proto-Valyrians in Asshai is House Dane, of course. Various members of House Dane have been popping up all throughout the first 4 books with either purple eyes or silverish hair or both. However, George has specified they do not have any Targaryen blood and they are never named as one of the Valyrian houses. It just so happens that they claim to not be first men but to have come to Westeros in the Dawn Age following the track of the falling star. So they came from somewhere else, and oh, by the way, they've got that sword that is probably Lightbringer, and the legend of Lightbringer and Azor Ahai comes from Asshai, as we know. And so yeah, the Danes sure look an awful lot like some Proto-Valyrian Dragon Lords from Asshai who came to Westeros with Lightbringer sometime around the Long Night. And it's not just me saying that. In fact, after Book 4, so before Dance with Dragons and before The World of Ice and Fire and all that stuff about the Great Empire of the Dawn, none other than Elio Garcia of the Westeros.org forums and co-author of The World of Ice and Fire and Blood with his wife Linda and, of course, George Martin. He used to theorize on the Westeros.org forums back in the day, and after Book 4, he speculated that there was some sort of common ancestor between the Valyrians and the Danes. And as you can see, we also have enough information in the first 4 books to know that the place to look for Proto-Valyrians is Asshai. And then Septon Barth came along and dropped the bomb on us and told us that the ancient Asshai flat out say they taught the Valyrians everything they know about dragon lording, and probably blood magicking and slavery and a few other things. So getting back to our quest to find out if the Bloodstone Emperor's Black Stone is in Stygian, the question becomes, was the Great Empire of the Dawn one and the same as these Proto-Valyrians? Well, there's a pretty big clue about that, 5 of them actually, and they are called the 5 Forts. The 5 Forts came in at number 4 on our Wonders of Essos and Sothorios video, thanks for watching. And the main thing about them is that they are made out of fused black dragonstone, the same thing that the Valyrians built out of. However, the Valyrians never came this far east. So somebody out here is using Dragon Lords to build very large fortresses, very large. They're supposedly 1,000 feet tall, and even if they're not, they're obviously very tall. There's 5 of them, and they're supposedly made completely of fused black stone. And just to be clear, fused black stone, not the same thing as the oily black stone. They could be related, but that is a theory. They are presented as different substances. We know how the fused stone is made. The oily stone we have to guess at, which we'll do at the end of the video. So who built the 5 forts? Well, the Yetish scholars say that it was the Great Empire of the Dawn, the Pearl Emperor, in fact, who was the second listed emperor of the Great Empire of the Dawn. And that could be the second dynasty, but the point is, it was a long time before the Bloodstone Emperor and the Amethyst Empress, supposedly. And it's important to realize that Yeti is the empire that sprung up in the same place as the Great Empire of the Dawn right after the Long Night. And if Yeti had built the 5 forts, they would claim them. They are very impressive. But of course, Yeti was never said to be a Dragon Lord civilization. And Yeti says they were there already, thousands of years ago. So that's the 5 forts piece of evidence. And then the other piece of evidence that the Great Empire of the Dawn were the Proto-Valyrians comes from a Game of Thrones, actually. That's right, going back to the first book. And it's Dany's famous Wake the Dragon dream. Ghosts lined the hallway, dressed in the faded raiment of kings. In their hands were swords of pale fire. They had hair of silver and hair of gold and hair of platinum white. And their eyes were opal and amethyst, tourmaline and jade. So those 4 gemstones, opal, amethyst, tourmaline, and jade, those are 4 out of the 8 gemstones listed as the dynasties of the Great Empire of the Dawn. But let's just think about how this came across to us when we read A Game of Thrones before the World of Ice and Fire existed, before the Great Empire of the Dawn was written about. At that point, these just seem like weird Valyrian ancestors, right? Like they all have Valyrian hair, one of them has purple eyes, and they're all chanting for Dany to wake the dragon. But like I said, only one of them has purple eyes, the other 3 have different color eyes, so who are they? They're not Valyrians. This suggests that George, right from the beginning, was always thinking about other races of Dragon Lords. Perhaps you might say cousin, tribes or clans to the Valyrians, ones that didn't make it. And since Dany thinking that dragons first came from Asshai is also in Book 1, this would be George planting the seeds. Remember, he's a gardener. This would be him planting the seeds for eventually explaining those ancient Asshai dragon lords. Now, the fact that these gemstone-eyed ghosts also have swords of pale fire in their hands that obviously match the Azor Ahai legend from Asshai, and perhaps also the idea of the sword Dawn being caught on fire. Because of that phrase, pale fire. Dawn is always described using the word pale. It's pale as milk glass. It's made from a pale stone. And there's a tower in Starfall called the Pale Stone Sword Tower. So if Dawn were ever to catch on fire, one would imagine it would burn with pale fire. And so all of that is further evidence that George, right from the beginning, was imagining these dragon lords with different eye colors as the ancient Asshai dragon lords, the ancestors of the Valyrians, and thus also Dany's ancestors. So then when George comes along later and writes The World of Ice and Fire, he's gardenering out Asshai and all that Far East stuff. Then he reached back to A Game of Thrones, took the 4 gemstones used in the eyes of those dragon lord ghosts, and used them as 4 of the 8 gemstones of the Great Empire of the Dawn rulers. And by doing so, he's essentially telling us that's who Dany saw, the Great Empire of the Dawn rulers. Those are the kingly dragon lord ghosts. So here I will just point out that one of the main criticisms that I hear about Great Empire of the Dawn theory is that it's all in the World of Ice and Fire. It's not in the main books. But as you can see, ancient dragon lords from Asshai is definitely at least a theory rooted in the main books, and especially in A Game of Thrones, where Dany flat out says it. She flat out says it. It's not even a theory. It's just an idea that may or may not be true that Dany heard. But of course, it becomes a theory when you add in all the Azor Ahai stuff and Bran's vision, etc. So basically, Great Empire of the Dawn theory, the theory is that Great Empire of the Dawn is just the name of the ancient Asshai Proto-Valyrian dragon lords. That's all. That's all it is. That's just him world building out and garnering out the original idea of dragon lords from Asshai. I think I've made my point. Let's move on to the next clue that the Great Empire of the Dawn and the ancient Asshai Proto-Valyrian dragon lords are the same people, and this time we're going to talk logistics. The logistics-based arguments are compelling here, actually, because a city as big as Asshai, built thousands of years ago, would have been built by a large, thriving civilization. Just as the ancient city of Uruk was built by the Sumerian civilization, just as the Indus Valley civilization built Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, etc., etc. And so if we're looking for a large Dawn Age civilization in this area that could have built Asshai, the Great Empire of the Dawn is really just the obvious candidate. They are a huge empire encompassing all the habitable land east of the Bones and west of the Grey Waste and the Mountains of the Morn. So Asshai is already arguably inside these described borders that I've highlighted here on the map. The Great Empire of the Dawn supposedly existed for thousands of years up until the Long Night and then ended during the Long Night. And that's exactly when we think the Shadowlands was transformed, when the Bloodstone Emperor's meteor fell. So the timeline fits, and this all implies that before the meteor fell, the Shadowlands Peninsula might have been a sweet place to live. You know, the type of place where a large civilization might build their capital city. Because a Dawn Age metropolis like ancient Asshai basically has to exist in a fertile area where farmlands can sustain an urban population. And that implies that there must have been farmlands around here once. You know, before the shadow fell. Asshai is equatorial and watered by a river that may not have always been toxic. And bottom line, a large urban population could never live in a place where children can't survive. How are you going to carry on the population? Asshai is less than 10% populated, and they survive only on water and food that's brought there. So yeah, you'd need to be able to raise children to keep the city full. And you can't do that now. You just don't need a city as big as Asshai for a handful of dark wizards to study magic by the shadow. And the way Asshai is now, dark and shadowed, seemingly it's been that way as long as anyone can remember. So what seems like happened here is that Asshai was originally built out of normal stone. And then later, through the dark magic of this Long Night Shadow event, all of the stone turned toxic and oily and black. Because remember, even the streets are made of oily black stone. If oily stone was some special stuff that you had to quarry from somewhere, why would you use it even for the streets? It just kind of makes more sense that whatever shadow magic is emanating from Asshai has gradually transformed everything. Now, just because I like to practice mental flexibility, I will entertain a couple of different theories that Asshai could have been built out of oily stone. We'll come back to those at the end of the video, and they are called the Winchester Mystery House Theory and the Deep Ones Theory. But let's keep this thing on track. We're trying to answer the question, could Bloodstone Emperor's meteor be the thing in Stygian? And so yes, if the Great Empire of the Dawn built Asshai, then Asshai is probably where he usurped the Amethyst Empress. And that means that Stygian, the heart of the shadow, is a great place to look for his black stone that fell from the sky. We can picture him hiking up the hill to Stygian to receive orders from Nyarlathotep or Azathoth or whomever, kind of like a twisted version version of Moses ascending Mount Zion to receive the 10 Commandments. Instead, he got the 10 abominations. And actually, I might guess that Stygai didn't even exist before the Long Night, but rather was built by the Bloodstone Emperor as a shrine at the spot where the meteor fell. You know, so he could go there to worship it. But folks, as cool as I've made Stygai sound and as much as I like meteors, don't worship black meteors and don't go to Stygai, because it's a trap. A trapezohedron, a shining trapezohedron from outer space. And before I go any further, I have to give a giant shout out, of course, to Grey Waste Tim. Check out his Color Out of Asshai video, which is kind of a longer and more thorough explanation of the stuff I'm about to say in the next 5 or 10 minutes. And honestly, I wouldn't know any of this stuff without Grey Waste Tim, so all credit to him. Make sure you're subscribed to his channel. But basically, we're going to talk about 2 H.P. Lovecraft stories here, A Color Out of Space, and, well, a couple of stories that involve the shining trapezohedron. So, friends, if we're talking about a strange, magical meteorite which gradually poisons the land around the impact zone, well, that's the plot of A Color Out of Space. A strange meteor falls on the Gardner farm in Arkham, Massachusetts. It twists and mutates and eventually kills all the life it encounters, whether flora or fauna. At first, the plants on the farm grow strangely huge and colorful, but they are inedible and nasty tasting, and the plants eventually turn gray and brittle. The meat of the animals on the farm similarly is inedible, so think of the blind white fish that only fools and shadowbinders will eat. And eventually, the post-meteor impact Gardner farm comes to become the blasted heath, because all those gray brittle plants eventually just turn to dust. So you could call it a gray waste, and here's a quote. 5 acres of gray desolation that sprawled open to the sky like a great spot eaten by acid in the woods and fields. And then it's also called a shadowed valley of desolation. So that's cheerful. And in the context of the story, which takes place 50 years after the original impact, the blight is still spreading slowly and encompassing more and more area into its gray waste. But it's only been 50 years. So when we look at the Shadowlands, well, it's had 8,000 years to marinate in the glow of the toxic black meteor. So George may just be thinking about a Gardner farm situation that's had, much longer to develop. And that would explain the transformation of the entire Shadowlands. Unfortunately, all of that is the least bad thing that the meteor does. It also brings an unseen intelligence, one which enslaves people to worship it through evil magic. It then causes those people to go quite mad and commit all kinds of violent acts of mayhem, and most of the people eventually die horrible deaths. Now, this color out of space is the color of the meteor and the meteor energy that swirls around it, and the same color also shimmers and reflects from all the plants and people and everything it touches. Lovecraft spends a lot of time describing the indescribable color in creative ways, but the main idea is that it is some sort of strange swirl of iridescent colors that are outside the visible spectrum. And like I mentioned, the well is a big part of it. The well is where the spirit lives, and the well water spreads the toxicity. So, like I said, the Shadowlands is basically the Gardner farm times 8,000 years. Everything is gray and desolate, only poisonous plants and mutated animals live there. If you think of oily or greasy blackstone, George is partially describing that iridescent shimmer that's on the surface of a puddle of oil. So that's very similar to this iridescent space color. And then we've got the river ash spreading the poison like the well water. And so yeah, there's an evil Lovecraftian meteor in Stygai. It probably brought a space demon with it to Earth, and that space demon was the one telling the Bloodstone Emperor to do all the horrible stuff. Now, if you watched my Shadowlands video last week, again, thank you. I went into that in more detail. But A Color Out of Space is certainly one of the places where George would have gotten this idea. And the other place he would have gotten it is in the faceted surface of the shining trapezohedron. We're just going to talk about this real quick. Again, watch Grey Waste Tim's video. But essentially, it's a lot like a glass candle. It enables the user to peer through time and space and gain access to terrible hidden knowledge. The shining trapezohedron can communicate with Yog-Sothoth and summon Nyarlathotep. It was created on Yugoth out near Pluto by a weird alien fungal race called the Migo, and more importantly, the shining trapezohedron in the Lovecraft timeline. It showed up in Lemuria before Lemuria sunk, and in Atlantis before Atlantis sunk. Sometime in the 1800s of the Lovecraft timeline, some dude named Enoch Bowen, shout out Bowen Marsh, well, he found the shining trapezohedron in the tomb of the Egyptian pharaoh Neferin-Ka. Unafraid of curses, he took the gem from the pharaoh's tomb and took it back to Providence, Rhode Island. where he started the Church of Starry Wisdom under the influence of Nyarlathotep. So it's all according to his plan, I guess. Eventually the stone gets thrown into the bay and it continues to possess people. And see, the problem here is that Nyarlathotep can only come out at night. And so if you keep the gemstone in a place that receives daylight, he can't come out during the day. But unfortunately, it's at the bottom of the sea, so now he's got a free hand or something. So, in A Song of Ice and Fire, it's the Bloodstone Emperor, instead of Enoch Bowen, who founds the Church of Starry Wisdom after finding the black stone that fell from space. He then worships it, casting down the true gods, and commits all kinds of psychotic evil. And when we think about the Trapezohedron being empowered when it's in the dark, well, the black stone is in Stygai, the heart of shadow, from which the darkness emanates. I mentioned glass candles. They're kind of similar to the Trapezohedron in function. And who uses the glass candles? Quay the Shadowbinder from Asshai, and also Myron the Mage, who may be a member of Starry Wisdom cult, which he may have joined in Old Town, where they have strange sailors' temples, or in Asshai, where he visited. And in fact, the information in the World of Ice and Fire about the oily stone and stuff, that comes from Marwyn the Mage. So just like I was saying in the Shadowbinders video, all this stuff in Asshai is basically connected and tied to Long Night Matters. And just as the shining Trapezohedron always shows up right before a big disaster, the Bloodstone Emperor's black stone seemingly is the thing that transformed the Shadowlands, and I think caused the Long Night. And there may have been other meteor impacts as well, but that's a theory for another video. The Great Empire of the Dawn basically is George's version of Atlantis, or you might even say Numenor, which is based on Atlantis. And so yeah, it would make a lot of sense if the Bloodstone Emperor's black meteor is George's version of the shining Trapezohedron. And as Greyways Tim has taught me, Nephren Ka himself is part of the inspiration for the Bloodstone Emperor. Nephren Ka built a windowless temple around the shining Trapezohedron so it could always live in the dark, so Nyarlathotep can roam free. And the walls of his tomb are basically inscribed with all of these prophecies that he got, all these visions that he got from the Trapezohedron. He spent all his time scrawling these things into the walls like a madman. And so yes, Stygai is a meteor temple. Theory confirmed. All right, we're back on day 11 of filming to talk about the Stygian Serpent Men. And yes, we are right in the thick of everything I know about the Shadowlands I learned from a bunch of authors who wrote books at least 70 years ago. And we've also got some J.R.R. Tolkien coming, as well as just a dash of Ursula K. Le Guin, Michael Moorcock, and a little town in Germany with a bunch of buildings made out of meteor impactite stone that we know that George visited. But we gotta go fast or else I'm not gonna be able to get this video out this week. So, Stygian is originally a term used by the Greeks to describe things relating to the river Styx. And then over time it's come to refer to things of the underworld more generally. So for example, in A Dance with Dragons, the Dragon Tamer chapter, it was black beyond the doors, a sullen Stygian darkness that seemed alive and threatening, hungry. Quentin could sense that there was something in that darkness, coiled and waiting. So as you can see, George is using Stygian to mean dark, hellish underworld, having a brimstone stink, if you will. And originally in Greek mythology, Styx is both a goddess of the underworld and a river that you have to cross to gain entrance to Hades. That's only in some legends, though. In other stories, it's the river Acheron that you have to cross to gain entrance to Hades. And accordingly, Robert E. Howard used both Stygia and Acheron for names of kingdoms in Conan's world. And in fact, Acheron is a daughter kingdom to Stygia. So the immediate implications here for Ice and Fire is that the River Ash and Asshai are kind of like the gateway to hell, a place where the powers of the underworld manifest, in physical reality. So in the Conan verse, Robert E. Howard has created a land called Stygia and his own version of the river Styx that flows through Stygia. It's a land of dark magic and slavery and sorcery, and it's ruled by unholy priest kings. They all worship the demon serpent god named Set, who's sort of borrowed and adapted from Egyptian mythology. And in the Conan verse, it is Set who created a race of people called the Serpent Men of Valusia. So this really is the biggest takeaway for our purposes today. Stygia's association with black magic and also serpent people. So it seems like George has translated that into Ice and Fire as men from the shadow having tamed dragons first, and Asshai having been built by serpent men or dragon men. And going back to the quote we just read, you'll notice the Stygian darkness there is a pit that contains dragons. So that is kind of a more direct clue, actually, that dragons come from Stygia, from the shadow. And then just real quick, Stygia also has a few other cities which seem to have given George some inspiration for both Asshai and Stygia. The first is Kemi, and that's taken from the Egyptian name for their own land, Kemet, which sometimes becomes Kemi, and that means black land, which is a reference to the dark, fertile soil found near the Nile River. So the word alchemy is actually taken from Kemi, with alchemia meaning the Egyptian science, and both Robert E. Howard, who wrote the Conan stories and stories in the Lovecraft universe, as well as Lovecraft himself, both borrowed heavily from Egyptian names and ideas. So Stygia's Kemi, and this is kind of the point, it's the priestly capital of the nation, but not the royal capital. Just as Stygia seems to be some unholy meteor shrine or temple to a dark god, and not a place where people live. The Conan story called Hour of the Dragon calls Kemi a dead, nameless city, which sounds a lot like Stygia the Corpse City, and it's located where the river Styx empties into the ocean. And that would parallel Asshai's location where the river Ash empties into the ocean. Then we have Pteon, or Teon, I'm not sure if it's like pterodactyl or what, but it's an abandoned cursed city in eastern Stygia, and it is rumored, meaning it was, built by the Serpent Men of Eleusia. It was the original home of the Black Wizards, who later fled to Kemi when Pteon was taken over by the desert. So these Serpent Men of Eleusia, just real quick, they are lizard people who can disguise themselves as humans, and who enslaved the ancient inhabitants of Stygia. And again, they worship the demon serpent god Set. So that's one more point for there being some sort of demon god in Stygia. And then finally, from Conan Stygia, we have the independent city of Heorot. It's called the City of the Hawkmen, and that's why George put a City of the Winged Men east of the Bones Mountains. And the men there ride giant mutated hawks. How did they mutate, you ask? Well, I'll give you one guess. It was a meteor, that's right. It was a green starstone. So this is yet another place that George might have got an idea about a magical meteorite that gives people special powers, but also causes, strange mutations. So from Heorot to Hirkun. And we're done with Conan now, and I just have a couple of random things I didn't have anywhere to put. Didn't want to give him a whole section, but yes, Hirkun, Elric of Melniboné. As we all know, Melniboné is primarily an inspiration for Valyria. The Melnibonéans are haughty dragonlord sorcerers with magical black dragon swords who suffer a great downfall, partially by Elric's hand, just as Aenar Targaryen may have helped engineer the doom. However, George used the name of Elric and his cousin Irkun, who have the two black dragon swords, Stormbringer and Mournblade. He used those two names as alternate names for Azor Ahai, Eldric Shadow Chaser and Hirkun the hero. That directly implies that Azor Ahai was a dragon lord, just as Elric and Irkun of Melniboné were, and it implies that Asshai was a dragon lord civilization that suffered a great downfall, just like Valyria and Melniboné. And in case you didn't see this before, here are the maps of Eldric's world and Asshai by the Shadow. George apparently had his map maker draw them so that they match up, which is pretty cool. And then final note on Elric, the patron god of Elric and all of Melniboné is a chaos lord who's basically a demon, and that would be Arioch, aka Lord of the Higher Hell, Lord of the Seven Darks, and Knight of the Swords. Arioch is one of the most powerful dukes of hell, so yeah, he's a demon god. So did Azor Ahai come from a nation that worships a demon god? Lord of the Seven Darks. It really does sound on the money for a demon god lurking in the shadow. And then just a really quick note on Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea books, which George Martin has cited as an inspiration many times. I've never read those books, but YouTube user B. Kubayako left this comment on the Shadowbinders video. And as you can see, they've gone from Great Empire of the Dawn theory skeptic to Great Empire of the Dawn theory enjoyer because of this passage from A Wizard of Earthsea, which is about a dragon lord that comes under the sway of a speaking stone that lay in a far northern land. The story is written in an in-universe book called Matter of the Dragons, and it says that this speaking stone speaks to him and, by hearing its commands, accidentally summons something, quote, which did devour him out from within, and in his shape walked, destroying men. So this definitely sounds like a Nyarlathotep Lovecraft-inspired idea to begin with, and it's yet more lizard men, serpent men that can pose as humans, and that worship a mysterious stone that has an entity inside of it. So yeah, there's kind of a theme developing here. And then finally, another thing that some of you mentioned in the comments of the Shadowbinders video, thank you very much for watching and commenting, is Gnosticism. Famously, George mentions that Relorism is based both on Zoroastrianism, but also Catharism. And Catharism is a highly dualistic and somewhat heretical, if you will, form of Gnosticism. They considered themselves Christians, however, they actually believed that the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, who created the physical world, was something called a demiurge, which is kind of like an evil demon god. They're dualistic, so this is the bad god, and the good god is the God of the New Testament who created all things spiritual. They saw the physical world basically as a torment and a trap and a test, with the whole goal being to ascend to the spiritual world. And the big takeaway here for Ice and Fire is that a god that a lot of people worship as the god of light and goodness, R'hllor, could actually be a demon, one who lives in the heart of shadow, which by now that case is looking really strong. All right, it's time to get absolutely assassinated for my pronunciation of words from Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, but nevertheless, I persist. Minas Morghulis, Minas Morghulis, and also Mordor. The Shadowlands definitely seems inspired by Mordor. I mean, look at the maps. They're kind of in the same place. They're always in shadow. The Bloodstone Emperor is the closest thing to a Dark Lord. And actually, the Bloodstone Emperor is very heavily inspired by someone named Ar-Pharazôn from the Silmarillion. And there's also a version of him on Rings of Power. We'll not talk about that. But the point is, Ar-Pharazôn is the last king of Numenor, and he is corrupted by Sauron, who tricks him into worshipping Melkor, who's very much a god of darkness and the closest thing to a demon god we'll find in Tolkienverse. So Ar-Pharazôn, he usurps Tar Miriel, who's the rightful ruler of Numenor. So think Bloodstone Emperor usurping Amethyst Empress, with Tar Miriel meaning jeweled daughter, so Amethyst Empress, jeweled daughter Tar Miriel. And Ar-Pharazôn also cuts down the sacred white tree Nimloth, with the cutting being saved by Elendil and eventually becoming the White Tree of Gondor. And then finally, Ar-Pharazôn, under the influence of Sauron, he actually builds a temple to Melkor. And that's where they burn the sacred Nimloth tree, which creates a huge pillar of black smoke that stains the dome black. And that would obviously compare well to the Bloodstone Emperor building Stygai as some sort of dark temple or shrine around the location of the meteor, which carried the dark god that he worships to Earth. And then, as I've talked about in my Origins of Old Town and my Great Empire of the Dawn Westeros videos, House Dane comes into this too. They seem to be based on the Dunedain, who were the faithful Númenóreans. They fled Numenor before the downfall, bringing with them the magic sword Narsil, which seems a big inspiration for Dawn and Lightbringer, and then building the Gondorian cities of Minas Tirith, Minas Ithil, and also the Orthanc Tower. So yeah, the Shadowlands look a bit like Mordor. However, there's not really a city inside of Mordor. However, in the mountains surrounding Mordor, called Ephel-Duath, which means Mountains of Shadow, we do find a city built all of black stone, one which was a stronghold for Sauron's forces and the Nazgul. And that city, of course, would be Minas Morghulis, formerly Minas Ithil. And so right away you can see that George used Morgul as a Valyrian word in his story. It's both the name of a dragon, Morgul, who is a black dragon per the canon artwork from Fire and Blood. And of course he's black because it's a black city in the Mountains of Shadow in Tolkienverse. And then more widely known, of course, is the phrase Valar Morghulis, which means all men must die. It's kind of funny what George did here. Valar means men, even though Tolkien's Valar are the gods. They are not the men. They're the highest gods of the world. So in Sindarin, Morgul means black magic or dark sorcery. And Tolkien, who is a linguist, is drawing off the Latin root word mors, which is the French mort, and that's where we get mortality, morgue, and so on and so forth. So the Valyrian Morghulis means die or to die or must die. But if we translate Valar Morghulis into Sindarin, we get the dark sorcery of the gods, the dark magic of the Valar. And that's exactly what we've got in Stygai. Again, some sort of evil god casting a shadow over the Shadowlands. And then just going a little further on Tolkien's linguistics, the Sindarin root word of Morgul supposedly is Mor, and that's a shortening of the Sindarin Morn, which means black. So that's why Mordor is the Black Land. Mordu means Black Night. Morgul, again, black arts or dark sorcery. There's Mormogil, the nickname for Turin Blacksword, who carried a black sword. That means black sword, Mormogil. Mornin means dark veil, and that means the mountains of the Morn, just east of Asshai. Well, those are actually the Black Mountains, and indeed they are. And then finally, there's a later Sindarin version of Morn, which is Vorn, and that also means black, so Vorian Dane, the sword of the evening, everyone. George is a big fan of Tolkien. But that's all prelude. Let's talk about Minas Morghulis. It used to be the Gondorian city of Minas Ithil, a twin to Minas Tirith, which is the main white city that we see in Gondor. So originally they were twin white cities, but you know, something bad happened, which was that it was taken by Sauron and renamed Minas Morghulis. The dark shadow of Mordor fell over it, and it transformed into a city entirely of black stone. Minas Ithil originally held a palantir, which was called the Ithil Stone, which Sauron captured, and that's the one that Sauron uses to corrupt both Denethor and Saruman in Lord of the Rings. So yeah, Sauron's palantir came from Minas Morghulis, and obviously we have glass candle users in Asshai, like Quaithe, so that's a parallel. Now, to really get the full picture of what's going on, we just have to read a little bit of Tolkienic prose, so here we go. All was dark about it, earth and sky, but it was lit with light, not the imprisoned moonlight welling through the marble walls of Minas Ithil long ago. Tower of the moon, fair and radiant in the hollow of the hills. Paler indeed than the moon ailing in some slow eclipse was the light of it now, wavering and blowing like a noisome exhalation of decay. A corpse light, a light that illuminated nothing. and that is from the two towers, the stairs of Cirith Ungol, and as you heard, the nickname of Minas Ithil was Tower of the Moon. But Minas Morghulis' nickname is the Dead City. So again, Stygian, the corpse city, and also black moon meteors. We don't have time for moon meteors today, but if you know what I'm talking about, there it is. The entire city of Minas Morghulis is made from black stone that has corrupted moonlight. So this reminds us of the weird magical way that the oily black stone of Asshai drinks the light, and the way everything is just barely lit. And then there was also the eclipse language, which, you know, is part of the long night mythology as well, because George has got the one legend about the moon wandering too close to the sun. That's when the dragons hatched, meaning the moon meteors, and the moon wandering too close to the sun is just a mythical way to describe an eclipse. So lots of oily black stone and moon meteor stuff here at Minas Morghulis, which makes it a favorite of mine. Alright, so what is the oily black stone? I feel like we've sewn up the theory that the Bloodstone Emperor's black meteor is in Stygian. But what is the oily black stone of Asshai made of? What is it exactly? As I mentioned, there's just way too much of it for it to be meteorite stone. We never get meteorites that big. One of the biggest meteors to ever strike Earth was the Chicxulub meteor, the dinosaur killer. That was approximately the size of Mount Everest, which means 6 miles in diameter. But it all basically vaporized and fused with the bedrock, or became tektites, etc., etc. And that's the key thing to grasp here. When meteors hit the bedrock, they melt, they vaporize, and it fuses to make a new type of stone, which is called impactite. And there's several types of impactite. And the reason why this happens is because asteroids and comets and things impact the Earth at speeds like 12 miles per second. And by the way, the fastest bullets are under 1 mile per second. So take Mount Everest and launch it at the Earth 12 times faster than the fastest bullet. And what happens when you do that is that mountain of rock compresses and superheats all the air between it and the ground as it gets closer to the ground. Those waves of superheated compressed air are thousands of degrees hot, and they are basically melting the ground before the meteor even hits. So most of the meteorite ends up fusing with the bedrock, or even all of it, but sometimes there is a meteor left over. It all depends on the conditions. I'm not a geologist, but the point is impactites are metamorphic rock, which means they were transformed under heat and pressure. So I mentioned there's a town in Germany where a lot of the buildings are made out of impactite. It's named Nordlingen, and we know that George visited it in 2000 when he was doing a tour of various towns in Germany that have medieval castles, because he loves castles. Nordlingen is one of the only German medieval towns that still has its exterior walls intact. And again, many of the buildings, including the main church, it's made out of this impactite. Now, it doesn't look like oily black stone, but the point is, George could have gotten the idea of making buildings out of impactite. And it really does make more sense that all of this oily stone was transformed in place after someone had built a city out of normal stone, like I was saying. Or even that this is all impactite created at the location of the meteor strike, and that people then harvested it from Stygian, carried it downriver, and built Asshai afterward. Now, I definitely favor the idea that it's just a magical wave of shadow energy that emanates out from Stygian and transforms everything, and that George is just sort of loosely inspired by Nordlingen. And what I suspect happened, since he's a gardener, is that originally the sea stone chair, which is the first oily black stone that we see, George may have originally intended for that to be a meteorite. It's definitely about the size of several famous meteorites. However, once he got to the world of ice and fire and did the world building for Asshai and decided that Asshai is completely oily black stone, well, he had been to Nordlingen by then, so maybe he's thinking of it as transformed meteorite stone, impactite, or just magically shadowed stone. So we will close with the two promised wacky theories about how Asshai could have been built out of oily black stone. The first one would be the deep ones theory. Obviously, fish people, squishers, deep ones, whatever. They are associated with the oily black stone both on the Iron Islands and on the Isle of Toads. And I would also say at Yin. Asshai is built right on the coast, so maybe deep ones came out of the sea and their hybrids went to Stygian and it's all an unholy deep one city. I don't think that fits with most of the other evidence from this video, but I did want to mention it. And then the other theory is what I call Winchester Mystery House theory. And that's the idea that the Bloodstone Emperor, possessed by this dark god, just had to keep building and building in some sort of crazy psychotic fashion. And the Winchester Mystery House is similar. It was owned by Lady Winchester, who had to appease all the ghosts of all the men that were killed by the Winchester rifles. And the ghost demanded that she just build endlessly. And so there's this big maze-like house. It's very cool. I've been there. And so maybe Asshai is just the Winchester mystery house of the Bloodstone Emperor built out of oily black stone. Let me know in the comments what you think, but I'm gonna go and edit this video now and try to get it out this week. So cheers, thanks for watching. I do love you guys, and that's why I make these videos. So please help me get to 150,000 subs by making sure you are subscribed below the video. Click the thumbs up button. And again, leave a comment and tell me what you think of all this crazy stuff, because I definitely think there's a demon god in Stygian, and also maybe in the heart of winter and under the sea, and maybe all the gods in Ice and Fire are demon gods. I will have Greyways Tim on a live stream very soon to talk about all this. I've been David Lightbringer. See you next time.